Hello everyone. In this video, we'll take a look at Nmap, a software which is widely used in computer networking and cybersecurity. And according to the official website, it has featured in several movies, including The Matrix, The Bourne Ultimatum, The G.I. Joe, Dread, and a few other movies. And it is used for reconnaissance, where you might want to gather information about a network, including the topology, the systems that might be active on a network, the operating system types and versions running on a network, and it might also be useful if you want to identify foreign systems on your network, because this might be an indicator of a network breach. And for ethical hackers, you might want to use Nmap to find vulnerable targets that you can exploit. And if you're preparing to take an entry-level certification like the CompTIA Security Plus, then you should be prepared to answer a question or two about Nmap. However, when you launch Nmap for the first time, you might be presented with a lot of syntax and options like you see on the screen. And for a beginner, you might easily get overwhelmed with all the options and syntax that you might see. So in this video, we'll look at some of the basic scan techniques that you should know. We'll look at how to perform a host discovery, port discovery, fingerprinting. We'll also take a look at the networking configurations, especially if you want to run Nmap in a virtual environment. It can be very tricky. So we'll look at how to network them with other virtual machines and be able to scan them. So let's get started by taking a quick look at the official Nmap website. Okay, so on the official Nmap website, which is nmap.org, you'd be presented with a screen where you have some news about Nmap and several other information. And there are several tabs. You can go to the download tab, and Nmap is open source, so you can download it for Windows, for Mac OS Linux, and even have the option to compile it yourself, so the source code is readily available. And we also have a reference guide in another tab where you can have information about Nmap. So if you have some specific topic that you want some more information about, you can just go to that chapter in Nmap and then quickly look at it, including the scan techniques, some information about host discovery, the various operating systems. And we have a book for Nmap. I believe you can buy it on Amazon. And we have some documentation as well, so for other languages as well. We have the graphical user interface version of Nmap, which is ZenMap, if you'd probably want that. But it's always the traditional ways to go through the command line or the terminal in Kali. And then we have a tab where all the movies that Nmap has appeared in is featured and mentioned here. So you can also take a look at that. So before we dive deep into Nmap, I think we should look at a few basics in computer networking, and then we can start using Nmap. So some of the basic things you should know in computer networking is the TCP IP model on the left and the OSI model on the right, and the protocols that exist in the various layers. So the OSI model on the right is a reference model, the older version. It has been simplified into the TCP IP model you see on the left. And these two models basically seek to put into context the various networking devices and protocols that exist in computer networking. And one which is of particular interest in Nmap is the transport layer, the TCP and UDP. But we have different devices and protocols existing at different layers. So for the TCP IP model, it combines the first two layers. And normally you have devices like switches, hubs, bridges working at this stage with Ethernet and Wi-Fi protocols working at this stage. On the internet layer, that's where we have address resolution protocol, we have the IP address working. And on the transport layer, we have TCP and UDP. There are two protocols that help to use different services and protocols above it, like the HTTP, FTP, JCP protocols, and a host of others that we'll quickly look at. So one thing you would want to do is to contrast between TCP and UDP, because it's a very critical concept when you come to using Nmap. So TCP is connection oriented in the sense that it guarantees and makes sure that packets that are sent are indeed received. So it uses something called a three-way handshake. So first, a synchronization packet is sent to a receiver to make sure that it's ready to receive a packet of information. And the receiver sends a synchronization acknowledgement packet, or what is called a SYN-ACK for short, to the sender to signal that they are ready to receive. And then the sender sends acknowledgement packet back, and then a connection is established. And at that point, packets can be sent back and forth. But for UDP, once a receiver makes a request to the sender just starts sending responses without guaranteeing whether those packets are received or not. But UDP is faster, and it's used for time-sensitive systems and protocols. TCP is is relatively slower, but it's used where guarantee is needed, especially for systems like login systems. It uses TCP for file share. File share also uses TCP. So in computer networking, we have several protocols that either use TCP or UDP. Some combine both, and they operate using ports. So port numbers are opened on each system, and there are given numbers, so they serve as reference points for the service or protocol that you are running. So because each service or protocol is given a number, they can operate simultaneously on the network. So you can send an HTTP packet and at the same time be sending an RDP packet from a client to a server, or from a sender to a receiver. And so you should be familiar with some of these port numbers and the protocols, because this is what is used in Nmap. So if you see a port 80 or port 443 in Nmap, you know that we are talking about HTTP. 22 is secure shell. 3389 is remote desktop protocol for remote access into a Microsoft system. SMB is a server message block for file share and printer share. And we have a few. So depending on which protocol you see, it will suggest the type of system that you're looking at. So if you see an HTTP or HTTPS open on a system, it most likely will be a web server. And if you see a secure shell, it means you'd have remote access to those systems. The same for RDP. And an SMB might be that you'd have a print server or a file share server. And if you see an SMTP, it means you probably would have an email server in there. MySQL will mean that you have a database server in there. DNS definitely will mean a DNS server. So if you see some of these ports, it will help you to know, especially for ethical hackers, which of these to hack. And some of these are targets for ethical hackers, especially for web servers, for database servers, and for file shares. So at this point, the next thing we want to look at is the Nmap scan techniques, the common ones. So the first one is what we call TCP SYN Scan. So it's a fast type of Nmap scan, and it's also known as a half open scan. And the host requests a connection without acknowledging it, and the target's response to the scan's SYN packet identifies the port state, and it's stealthy. But for new firewalls, they can easily read this type of scan. So if you remember, we just talked about the three-way handshake with TCP, starting with a SYN, and then a SYN-ACK, and then an ACK. So with this type of scan, instead of going through the three-way handshake, it only goes through the first phase of the handshake. So once a SYN is sent and an acknowledgement is received, it ends there. It knows that that system is ready to receive. So a full TCP connection is not established, so it's not registered in a log. But for new firewalls, it can read some of these types of scan. And this type of scan requires elevated writes. So you'd have to use on Linux, sudo, enter your password, and for Windows, you'd have to run administrative privileges. The second type is the TCP Connect Scan. So this time, it does a full three-way handshake, and it's relatively longer. It's not stealthy, and is the default type of scan if you don't specify your elevated writes. And the final type is the UDP scan. So with a UDP scan, it does not even use SYN and SYN-ACKs. Once a request is received, it starts sending the packets out. So with Nmap, it would need to wait for a response or connection timeout. So if a response is received once a request is made, it knows that system is ready, it's active and it's online, and you can probe further. If a response is not received after a time, you know that the connection will time out, meaning that that system is not active, it's not online. And for this reason, UDP tends to take a long time, especially if the system is not online, because it will resend requests for a number of times until a connection is timed out. So let's go back to a diagram and try to summarize these three scan methods. So we have a SYN Scan SS. So it just starts to, it will send a SYN packet and then a SYN ACK is received and it ends there. A full connection is not established. But with a TCP Connect Scan, which is the second one, it would complete a three-way handshake. And with a UDP scan, once a request is made from Nmap, responses are received. If responses are not received after a period of time, the connection will time out, meaning that that system is not ready to be probed any further. So at this point, it's time to launch VirtualBox, go into Kali, and try it on some virtual machines. Okay, so in my VirtualBox, I have several virtual machines. I have a Kali Linux. We'll be running Nmap from the Kali Linux operating system. And we also have a Windows Server 2022. It's a domain controller. It has Active Directory. We have a Red Hat, and then we have Mr. Robot. So Mr. Robot is actually a virtual machine I downloaded from Vulnhub. And if you're not familiar with Vulnhub, let me quickly introduce you to it. So this is Vulnhub. It's a website where you can download virtual machines. And most of these virtual machines are vulnerable. And it is used for what we call capture the flag games. So you might be given a specific objective with one of these vulnerable virtual machines. And you can download it into any of your hypervisors like VirtualBox or VMware Workstation Player. And you might most likely use Kali Linux to try to break into these virtual machines. However, my only caution is you should always gather enough information about a virtual machine before you download them, because you might be downloading a virus, a Trojan. So you should make sure that it's a popular virtual machine and people have done write-ups about these virtual machines. So personally, two virtual machines I can recommend is Kyoptrix and Mr. Robot. So you can just search for Mr. Robots and you should find it. And it's quite a popular vulnerable virtual machine that you can download. And when you go down, you see the write-up, several write-ups about it. So you know it's quite a credible virtual machine you can import onto your machine. Okay, so back to our VirtualBox, let's quickly look at how we might configure the networking settings before we run Nmap. So to configure the networking settings, you'd have to highlight the virtual machine you'd want to configure the settings for and go to settings on top and then look out for network. And what I have found so far is Nmap works best on bridged adapter mode. However, you can also create a NAT network, but what I have found so far is Nmap struggles when it has to use virtual IP addresses. However, in bridge adapter mode, it uses an IP address which is allocated by your router. So if you're using a TP-Link router, it uses that. If you're using your phone as a hotspot, it allocates it straight from your phone. And you might have more joy using the bridge adapter mode. However, the only concern is when you switch to bridged adapter mode, VirtualBox can see other systems running on your actual network. But for Nmap, it is relatively safe. However, for other types of pen testing software used on Kali, it's always best to run them in an isolated virtual environment. So for now, we'll set all our virtual machines that we want to run in bridged adapter mode. And you can go to advanced settings, and there's also a MAC address, and you can refresh it to generate a new MAC address. Make sure cable is connected and click on OK. So for now, we'll just configure only one adapter and click on OK. So you do this for all other virtual machines that you'd want Nmap to scan in a virtual environment. However, if you're running it on an actual PC and not in a virtual environment and you're scanning other systems, then you wouldn't have to go through all these different network modes. Also, the last thing I would mention is make sure all your virtual machines are active and running before you start scanning them using Kali Linux. Okay, so you're currently in Kali Linux and would want to launch Nmap. You have a few options. You can open a terminal and type Nmap, or you can just go to your applications and search for Nmap. It will still come back to the terminal. So you'll be greeted with the syntax and options you have in Nmap. You can maximize or increase the size of the text by using Ctrl, Shift, and plus, and it should be legible now. So let's clear our screen, and the first thing we'll do is we want to know our IP address for the network that we want to scan. And because Kali Linux is on the same network, we'll just do ifconfig. On the Windows, you probably do ipconfig, click on enter. So we have the loopback address, but we are looking at our Ethernet connection. So our IP address is 192.168.1.10, and the subnet mask is 255.255.255.0. And if you're not familiar with IP networking and subnet mask, I recommend my previous video on IP addressing and subnetting. It should appear in the right corner of your screen, and you probably will understand this better. So in Nmap, you should know your network address and your slash notation for the subnet mask. So deriving with this IP address and with this subnet mask, it's a classful subnet mask. So the subnet mask will be /24, and the network address will be 192.168.1.0. So we'll start by performing a TCP Connect Scan. So we'll type Nmap, bring a dash and then ST, and then we'll specify the network. So 192.168.1.0/24, and click on enter. So it probably will take a few seconds to scan the network. Okay, so we have results from the scan. And so here we have scan reports starting with HTC Frisbee at 192.168.1.1. So that's my default gateway. I'm actually using my phone as a hotspot. So that's why you have that here, HTC. And we have the Kali, the machine that I'm running on. And then we have a system on 192.168.1.143 with a number of ports opened, including 22, Secure Shell, HTTP, RPC bind, NetBIOS, and a few others. Yes, and then we also have another system here on 185.185. Also has two ports open, one closed, so Secure Shell is closed, and so 4 hosts are up. So let's try the same with a stealth scan and see if the results will be the same. So let's run Nmap. This time we have to do a sudo actually. So sudo elevated rights and then Nmap, and then we'll type the network. So that's 19. We'll type -SS actually. So that's a stealth scan before we type our network, which is 192.168.1.0/24. Click on enter. It will ask you for your password. So you enter your password and click on enter, and it should start scanning the network. Okay, so it's done scanning, and this time it says 6 hosts are up. So 2 additional hosts have been added using a stealth scan. This probably means that with the TCP Connect Scan, the firewall recognized it and blocked access to it. But with the stealth scan, it wasn't able to recognize it. And so it found 2 additional hosts. So let's quickly see, we'll see what exactly the host is. So from what I see here, we have a .38 included here, and that is, so we have a number of ports opened. We have LDAP, Microsoft DS, we have LDAP SSL, Kerberos, and Kerberos has to do with Microsoft login. So we know this has something to do with login systems, and I have a domain controller on my network. So I believe this is a Windows Server domain controller. And it also picked up another one, which is desktop, on .94. And I believe this is the host running my system or running the virtual machines. So those two Windows machines weren't picked up using the TCP Connect, but it was picked up using the stealth scan. I believe the Windows Defender firewall was blocking access using the TCP Connect. So at this point, after gathering some information about the whole network in general, you can zoom into a specific host or system that you want to probe even further. So at this point, let's start with 192.168.1.38. So I believe this is a domain controller, but we would want to know the operating system that is being used on this particular IP address. So let's dive deeper into that. So this time, let's do a sudo and let's use the stealth scan. And then let's use an option which is O. So O is to find out the operating system which is being used. So we call that fingerprinting. So, and we'll type the IP address of the host, which is 192.168.1.38. And I forgot to bring Nmap. So it's sudo and then Nmap before the -ss, the O, and then the IP address, and click on enter. Okay, so after scanning, we have some additional information. It's telling us that it's a general purpose device and it gets the operating system to be Microsoft Windows 2016, 2010 Vista. It's 93% sure. And it's not very, very accurate, but then it also goes ahead to do aggressive guessing and it gets it even more right. So it says it's a Microsoft Windows Server 2016. It's not far from right. It's 2022, but it's 93% sure. And that is a very good guess. And you can even go further to use a -A option to even probe even more aggressively and probably get a more accurate result. But I think this is good enough. We want to check another system. So let's try 192.168.1.38. Yes, okay, we just tried .38. So let's try .143 and let's see what will come. So let's do the same again. So we'll do sudo nmap -ss. We'll do -o, that's a capital O, and then 192.168.1.143 and click on enter. Okay, so this system is also telling us that we have a Linux 2.4 something, so X, but it's in the Linux 2.4 range. It's telling us it's a Linux kernel 2.4 and it has a few ports open. I think we already know that. And let's try one more system before we move on. So let's try .185, which is also on the network. So sudo nmap -ss, and then let's specify operating system, so O, and then 192.168.1.185, and let's click on enter. Okay, so I didn't get the IP address right, so we'll have to redo it. So just click the arrow up, and then let's go back and change it. So it's 192, yes, and click on enter. Okay, so it found this to be Linux 3.x or 4.x. It's using a Linux kernel in the 3 range, and it has a number of ports open. So at this point, we found a few things. We've learned how to use a stealth scan. We've learned how to use a TCP Connect Scan. We realized stealth scan is more productive than TCP Connect Scan, especially when there are firewalls blocking the probes that we want. And the last thing I would want to show you is what we call Nmap Scripting Engine. So Nmap has a scripting engine where people can create scripts and automate them. And one of them is for vulnerabilities. So you can scan a particular IP address in your network to find out if there are any vulnerabilities associated with them. So you use sudo, and then you pick a specific IP address. Let's pick one of those, which is an older Linux operating system. So let's try with the last one. We scanned .185. that has 3 ports. And mind you, the more ports you have open, the longer this scripting engine will take to perform a scan. So for now, let's just try the least open port. So we'll try the 185. So we'll specify sudo nmap, then you bring 2 dashes, and then you type script, and then you type vuln. That's for vulnerability. And then you specify the particular IP address, which is 192.168.1.185, and click on enter. Okay, so our script is done running and it has a result. So let's quickly look through it. So port 22 is closed, so there are no vulnerabilities there that it has identified. But port 80 is opened, and it says that cross-site scripting, there's no vulnerability there that it found. Cross-site request forgery vulnerabilities, it didn't find any. So these are all types of vulnerabilities. And it found some information that there's a possible administrative folder. It found some robot files, WordPress version 2. I think that's used for building a web server. It found some information here that might be of interest. It found a README folder, which is potentially interesting. And on port 443, it also didn't find anything related to cross-site scripting, that's XSS. But I found some information that is of interest. So this is the power of Nmap. This is what you can use Nmap for. There are a few other options that you can use, but I believe they should get you started. You realize that sometimes the scanning takes a while. There's an option for that, that's -T. You can specify the seconds within which Nmap scans. You can also disable DNS resolution and a few other things. But I believe you've learned something new. I believe you can find your way around Nmap as a beginner now. So we have come to the end of this tutorial. I hope it was helpful. So I'll encourage you to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified when new videos are released. So thank you for watching.